So, good morning. We're getting into chapter 15 today. I just wanted to point out at the very beginning of the chapter, there is another symbol, um, and it's there in red on the slide. It says, "Oh, look, another symbol, weather." Weather is often used in literature to kind of help create a mood, um, because and we can see here we've spent an entire paragraph really at the beginning of the chapter to talk about um, the weather, which probably isn't going to make that much difference to the story, but here we are. Okay. Where am I going here? Escape. Okay, here's the actual text. Okay, chapter 15. A huge thunderstorm woke us up early Friday morning. Lightning lit up the sky and rain pounded our roof and windows. I had hoped that the morning rain would make the courtroom more bearable, but the rain stopped early and the humidity it left behind only made the air in Sumner hotter and heavier. The courtroom was packed that morning. Grandpa figured this would be the last day of the trial, and I guess so did everyone else in Mississippi. Deputies brought in extra cane-bottomed chairs and squeezed them in wherever there was floor space. Spectators, newsmen, and photographers jammed the foyer outside the courtroom, and everybody was waiting for something big to happen. Mr. Breland called a bunch of character witnesses to testify, and each of them said about the same thing. Milam and Bryant had been born and raised in Mississippi. Milam was a war hero. They were good boys, hard workers, and never caused anybody a bit of trouble. When the seventh witness was finished, I was just about asleep, and then I heard Mr. Breland tell the judge, "Your Honor, the defense rests." A few people started clapping until Judge Swango stared them down. He looked at Mr. Chatham and asked, "Is the state prepared for its final arguments?" Mr. Chatham nodded, walked to the jury seats, and faced them, looking at each juror one at a time. When he finished making eye contact, he started speaking so loudly that it made me and Grandpa jump in our seats. He reviewed all the details of the eyewitness testimony of Mose Wright and Willie Reed, the prior confession of Bryant and Milam to kidnapping, the positive identification of the body of Emmett's mother, and others. Then he became very serious. He stopped pacing in front of the jury, and then he became very serious. He stopped pacing in front of the jury, took a deep breath, and continued with the last part of his speech. The first words that entered this case, "I want that boy from Chicago who did the talking at money," were dripping with the blood of Emmett Till. As far as the state of Mississippi is concerned, this is not about race. It's just another murder. But I want to say to you that the murder of Emmett Till was a cowardly and a brutal and unnecessary killing of a human being. His abduction at gunpoint was unjustified. This was a summary court-martial with the death penalty. That child had done nothing that could cause the defendants to invade the privacy of that home. When Bryant and Milam took Emmett Till from the home of Uncle Mose Wright, they were absolutely and morally responsible for his protection. I was born and bred in the South, and the very worst punishment that should have occurred, if they had had any idea in their minds that this boy did anything wrong, was to take a razor strap, turn him over a barrel, and whip him. I've whipped my boy. You've whipped yours. A man deals with a child accordingly as a child, not as a man to a man. The killing of Emmett Till was a cowardly act committed by the two defendants you see sitting before you. I know what you are and where we are, and I beg you to put aside race, tradition, and prejudice and consider the facts of this case as we have so clearly presented. This is not an issue of Negro versus white. This is not an issue of North versus South. This is a simple issue of the law. Two men murdered a child. You have no other choice but to convict them for murder." When he finished speaking, he stayed in front of the jury, looking again into the eyes of each one. Not a man tried to avoid his gaze. Then it was J.J. Breland's turn. He walked confidently to the jury, smiled, and while pointing to Bryant and Milam, said, "I've known those two boys for years. They're men of good reputation, respected businessmen in the community, and what I'd call real patriots." 100% Americans. This trial has been a waste of time and money. The prosecution talked generalities because the facts didn't bear out of the guilt of these defendants. "Where's the motive?" he shouted. "Where's the motive?" It's plain and simple that the state has no case, no evidence, no identification, no motive. They claimed that Till's wolf whistle at Mrs. Bryant at her store and money gave my clients enough reason to kill the boy. But both these men have testified to the authorities that they released the boy unharmed after his abduction because they determined he was not the one who had done the whistling. In no way did the state link up the dead boy with these defendants. Mrs. Bryant's own testimony did nothing to implicate Till in the incident at her store. She made it clear that Till had never had anything to do with her, that she'd never even seen the boy. So why, I ask you, would her husband go out of his way to injure a Negro boy who had committed no offense against him or his family? The only testimony that suggested Emmett Till did anything in connection with these defendants was Mose Wright's testimony that he had heard the boy had done something. However, any fool knows that if Mose had known Emmett Till was involved in something down there, he would have gotten him out and whipped him himself. And how could old Mose Wright tell whether the alleged kidnappers were black or white when he had a flashlight shining directly in his face in a completely dark house? It was so dark that night that Mose couldn't even determine the make of the abductor's car. Then he claimed the man identified himself as Mr. Bryant. I ask you, how many Mr. Bryants are there in the state of Mississippi? Had any of you gone to Mose Wright's house with evil intent, would you have given your name? There's nothing reasonable about the state's theory. If that's identification, if that places these men at the scene, he paused a moment and then shouted each word, "Then none of us are safe." I wouldn't put it past the NAACP and other northern rabble-rousers to plant a body in the Tallahatchie River and claim it was Till. There are people in the United States who want to destroy the way of life of Southern people. The state did not prove the body was Till's. It couldn't have been. You heard witnesses, qualified professionals, testify that the body had been in the water 2 weeks or more, while Till had been missing only 3 days before that body was found. Believe me, there are people who will commit any crime known to man to widen the gap between the white and the colored people of the United States. They would not go above putting a rotting, stinking body in the river in the hope that it would be identified as Emmett Till. My friends, these cold, calculating groups, along with the northern media, are doing everything they can to disrupt this trial, to destroy the South. I am sure that every last Anglo-Saxon of you has the courage to free these men in the face of that pressure. We have got to use our legal system to protect our God-given freedoms. If we do not, we have sinned before God and before our fellow citizens of the great state of Mississippi. He paused and then continued with a quieter, more even, serious tone. If you convict these two men, it would be admitting that freedom is lost forever. I'll be waiting for you when you come out from your deliberations. If your verdict is guilty, I want you to come to me and tell me where is the land of the free and the home of the brave. I say to you, gentlemen, your forefathers will absolutely turn over in their graves if you don't set these boys loose. When Mr. Breland finally sat down, the judge sent the jury out of the courtroom to decide whether or not Bryant and Milam were guilty. It seemed like a simple case to me. Mr. Breland's arguments were so full of holes that even I could see he didn't have a leg to stand on. There was no doubt that Bryant and Milam were guilty, and I was sure the jury would see it the same way. A few people left the courtroom, but Grandpa and I had stayed in that sweat box and waited. It had been a long week, and Grandpa looked exhausted. When the jury was dismissed, we talked a little, but then he dozed off, and I decided to let him sleep. I figured the jury would be out for a while. But barely an hour later, they came back in. When the judge asked them if they had a verdict for Bryant and Milam, the foreman stood up. Yes, sir. He cleared his throat and read from a paper he held. We find the defendants not guilty. The words triggered cheering and celebration. Bryant and Milam shook hands and slapped backs with their lawyers, and then they turned and kissed their wives. Somebody handed both of them cigars, and Bryant and Milam lit his up immediately. Now that the trial was over, photographers were free to snap photos, and flash bulbs were going off all over the room. People acted like it was the 4th of July and the Korean War had been just declared over. But in the midst of all that celebrating, I felt like someone had knocked the wind out of me. How could the jury find them innocent? These two men and others had murdered a boy, and now their fellow citizens had not only turned them loose, but were celebrating? It made me sick, and all I wanted to do was get out of there, out of Mississippi, and back home where things and people weren't so crazy. Grandpa didn't cheer and clap like most white men in the courtroom. As soon as the verdict was announced, he slumped forward and rested his head in his hands. He took several deep breaths, and a few minutes later he sat up. He looked better, almost relieved that the trial was over. Before he turned to leave, Milam, who was swarmed by reporters and friends, turned and looked right at Grandpa, grinned, and gave him the thumbs-up sign. Grandpa acted like he hadn't seen it. It took a while for the crowd to thin out enough for us to leave the courtroom. When we got to the foyer, an NBC TV reporter was interviewing Sheriff Strider about the trial. Is it true, the reporter asked, that you've been getting hate mail ever since the arrest of Bryant and Milam? I'm glad you asked me this, said the sheriff as he looked into the camera. I just want to tell all those people who have been sending me threatening letters that if they ever come down here, the same thing's going to happen to them that happened to Emmett Till. The reporter asked another question, but by then I was too far down the hall to hear what he had said. Besides, I didn't want to hear anything more about this case. I'd had all I could take.